What will you discover at Luray Caverns? From the tippy tops of their ropes course, breathtaking views of the Shenandoah Valley. From deep down in the caverns, wonder and awe from all the formations built over billions of years. And in the spaces in between, you can walk through history, see the evolution of the automobile, and even meet the mayor of Toy Town Junction. Open 365 days a year. Discover the perfect holiday adventure the whole family will love at Luray Caverns. Plan your trip at LurayCaverns.com.
Today on CityCast DC, Washington loves a good elites behaving badly story, whether it's real life or fiction, which is why we're hanging out today with Emma Sasaki, the pseudonymous author of a novel set at a DC private school that looks a lot like Sidwell Friends School, which just happens to be the writer's real-life alma mater. The book is called It's a Privilege Just to Be Here, and as you might expect, it's pretty scathing, especially about the parents. And those parents have been pretty scathing right back. Today is Thursday, November 21st. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Emma.
Hi.
If that is your real name.
Ha ha ha. One will never know.
So you wrote this book pseudonymously about a fictional school on Wisconsin Avenue with a chain link fence called Wesley Friends. You, in real life, attended a real school on Wisconsin Avenue, which was Quaker, and had a chain link fence. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Tell me about what made you want to write a book based on, a place you're a product of.
So during the pandemic, I lived in a townhouse across the street from the Bethesda Public Library. And right after the George Floyd murder, a big group of very young people held a protest and a rally in front of the library. And I remember looking out of my window and thinking, they're not in school, but look at them trying to make the world a better place and come together outside safely. And right around that same time, there were all these Instagram accounts that were, the first word was black at, and then usually it was black at, and it was the name of a private school. And as a Sidwell alum, I was very curious to see what was on that Instagram account. And I looked at it, and what really struck me was that there were all these anonymous posts, and I think most of them were from Black students, probably in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even in the aughts. And I remember looking at them and thinking, wow, I had the same experience, but I wasn't Black. And it's really too bad that we didn't have that conversation back then. And so I decided, well, I'm gonna try to write a novel around this. And I decided to use the school because I knew that it would provide richer detail if I wrote from something I knew and I experienced.
So you went there in the 80s or 90s or something. I don't want to date you too closely, but and I too, went to GDS in the 80s and 90s.
Down the street, cafeteria fee rival.
Right. And we were always like, us activist students were always like, we don't want to become like Sidwell. That was like always the left-wing cry, which I think the narcissism of small differences comes to play. But so what was it like for you then?
Well, I will say there weren't that many East Asians. There weren't that many South Asians. There were a handful of us. We certainly didn't communicate with one another or support one another. From what I understand, students have sort of affinity groups around their race and ethnicity these days, which I think can be a healthy thing, even if there's sort of an exclusionary element to it. At the time, it felt lonely, I would say. And there were very few East Asian teachers, which, I'm not sure whether that would have helped me or not, but I was a Sidwell lifer. So in my younger grades, during the trade wars, I was called, thinking about it now, maybe it's a little funny, but at the time it didn't feel funny. I was called, very silly names like Sony and Toshiba and, Mitsubishi instead of my name, which my mother would always tell me, well, just ignore. But I think there was a part of me that, obviously didn't like it. But I think the big thing is I didn't feel like there was anything I could do about it. And so I do feel now that the students The current students at Sidwell, I'm sure, but also at area schools, they probably feel much more comfortable pointing out that kind of behavior. I had a teacher tell me to my face that I was the reason why her family was displaced during World War II.
You personally?
Yes, it was in class at Sidwell. People say to me, wow, you must be so angry. That's why you wrote the book. And that's not really how I view it. I view it as they're probably kids who have gone through this and didn't feel like they could say anything. And I hope that they feel like they can say things now because we have better tools in terms of talking about race and racial incidents, I would hope.
So reading it, one of the things that occurs to me is how much, it is really a reflection of a radically changed Washington since the 80s and 90s, and including that the city has become significantly, more diverse in the sense of like diversity used to mean like, well, we got white people and we got black people.
Right.
And
right.
now most sort of elite institutions in Washington have a much, broader understanding of that term. But the other thing that's changed, and this is like, even more than the ethnicity piece comes clear in your book, is how glitteringly wealthy the city is. And a lot of the book is a sort of a satire of wealth and power that's sort of independent of ethnicity.
Mm-hmm. I mean, during the pandemic, I was disappointed that the school took PPP money. And I did let them know that as an alumnus. And I said, you have a huge endowment. You have a very wealthy parent population. I'm not sure why you're taking money that's meant for small businesses. And it just felt greedy to me. And this set against this backdrop of increasing wealth in the city and, increasing gentrification and an increasing wealth gap. And I thought to myself, who was the wealthiest person in my grade at Sidwell when I was there? And it wasn't wealth. It was more like we had very notable figures in the city, like very famous journalists or, people who worked on the Hill or lobbyists. But now these private schools, they attract a different population for better or for worse. And I don't think all the schools are like that at all. I wouldn't paint them with the same brush, but it does change the community. I think it ends up sort of changing the culture of the schools in a way.
For folks who haven't grabbed a copy, I read it last night and I felt like I needed to take a shower.
Is it? I'm not sure.
I think we're kind of underselling it because, it's a pretty rollicking story with a lot of pretty arch observation. It centers on a racist incident at the school and the community's response to it without giving away the store. Can you tell me what inspired you, to write about that particular topic and how this one incident and the whodunit kind of metastasizes?
Sure. I hate to say it, but I actually got the idea from a news article about a hate incident that happened on the campus. It is not the same as the hate incident in the book, but it was sort of parallel. But when I was writing the book, I was like, well, maybe this should be the starting point. So in the novel, the school is called Wesley Friends, and it's supposed to be sort of this, the shining city on the hill. It's supposed to be the exemplar for liberal thought and progressive ideas. How would they react to a hate crime? And I was hoping that it would start an honest conversation or self-reflection about what would you do? Like, what part would you play if something like that happened on your own school campus? How would you react?
So one of the things I loved about this was you sort of open every chapter with an excerpt from what is your stand-in for Black at Sidwell or for what I assume is your stand-in for DC Urban Moms, but it's very catty DC area privileged parent listserv. And there's all these great quotes. I don't know if they actually exist in real life or you made them up, but Wesley is just another name for affirmative action for rich parents. Were there other favorites of yours?
No, but the reason that DC Urban Mom sort of made an appearance in the book was because I used it for sort of not real research, but fun research. When I thought, let me see what parents are saying about private schools these days. And I was like, where am I going to find that information short of talking to all the private school parents who I know who will probably not tell me the truth anyway? And I thought the opposite of open, honest conversation might be an online bulletin board. And I remembered in the back of my mind, because when my kids were very young, my friends were using it to find nannies, and they all said it's a great place to find nannies. And I remembered, they have a private school for them. So I just sort of poked around and I read some of the comments, and some of them were just glittering gemstones. So I was sitting in bed watching, Netflix or something like that, and I got a text message, and it was from my friend who was stuck in traffic on the way from Miami-Dade to wherever she was going. She said, you finally arrived in Washington. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she said, well, you're in DC Urban Mom. And I said, what do you mean? I don't think I want that. And I was actually too afraid to look. So I had one of my former students who I'm in touch with. I said, would you mind taking a look at this website and tell me what they're saying? And so he went through it and he was like, wow, yeah, I don't know that you want to read this, but let me just say, I feel like they're proving your point.
So I'm curious whether you've had any of these interactions yourself or whether they're made up out of whole cloth with some of these characters.
I feel like what's happened to private school culture in DC and maybe in other areas in the country, I really don't know, is that for some reason, for some parents, it becomes an extension of themselves. It's like a brand. And so when you insult that brand, you are somehow insulting them personally. I honestly looked at some of these comments and I just thought to myself, wow, I wish I could have written this somehow into the novel, but that would be way too meta. I mean, it was very strange reading reactions to my novel, which was about this bulletin board on the same bulletin board. It was like, this is the worst book in the world. This person needs psychiatric help. Like, I wouldn't pay $30 for this. I was like, okay, but I feel like you did if you read the book. I mean, unless you stole it from somebody.
Well, do you think they had read it or they just heard it described and they were mad and preemptively?
I'm sure they read it because, there was a discussion about who could be who. And again, the parents are made up and the teachers are made up, but they were like, well, this person must be this person. And I was like, well, I enjoy the guessing game. I hope you had a fun week. It's a fiction. It's a work of fiction. But I used details because they are richer when they are from your real life. There were a few threatening ones. Those were not funny. I had to request to have them removed. There were ones that outed me and linked to my LinkedIn and linked to, all sorts of things. I looked at those and I was like, why is this so important to you? I found it sort of amusing and silly at the same time. And for all I know, it was the same, 5 people. Who knows?
Have you ever tried a squid ink margarita? What about a cotton candy old-fashioned? DC's bartenders are constantly raising the bar with wacky and delicious new cocktails. And what better way to try out their creations than during this year's Cocktail Week? This year's celebration is running Friday, November 29th through Thursday, December 5th, the 91st anniversary of Repeal Day. Whether you like a classic martini or a mixologist's strangest specials, DC Cocktail Week has something for everyone, with over 100 participating locations in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. Warm your belly this fall with special happy hours and tasting events from some of DC's best restaurants. Visit DCCocktailWeek.com for details. That's DCCocktailWeek.com. Cheers.
Let's be real, lawsuits are not fun, but with Paulson and Nace, at least they're a little easier. Paulson and Nace is a DC law firm in every sense of the word. It was founded here in 1979. Partner Chris Nace is a local who cares deeply about the DC community, even serving on the board of the local branch of the Living Classrooms Foundation in his free time. Nace and his associates Samantha Peters and Maya Perry handle medical malpractice, wrongful death, and other complex injury cases. And they don't just settle every case. They'll go to court. They'll fight for you. Paulson and Nace has even been recognized as one of U.S. News' best law firms. So if you have been hurt or lost a loved one because of someone else's mistake or negligence, call Paulson and Nace for a no-obligation consultation. Visit www.paulsonandnace.com. That's PAULSONANDNACE.com. Or call 202-463-1999. Your portraits of the kids are, sort of complicated and screwed up teenagers, but the portraits of the parents are pretty scathing. Are they, in your personal experience, are they that bad?
Most of the parents are made up. And that's the funny thing. I have had people text me and say, who is this? And I will say, that is no one. I made them up. They are composites. I think people want to assume that the main character is me, but that's not me either. So, if people think they know somebody in that book, then maybe it's just we have archetypes, wandering around our hallways, and I just sort of got lucky.
You were a kid, so you might not know, but do you think that the parents, the kind of people who send their kids or the way these people behave in the world has changed significantly since you were there yourself as a student?
Well, I think that parenting has changed, right?
Hmm.
And the sort of free range parenting, the benevolent sort of neglect, that doesn't really exist anymore. I guess people like to sort of phrase it as, depending on who you ask, helicopter parents or bulldozer parents, or and the thing is, my guess is that they exist in the public school as well. But the difference is, I think, when you're in a private school, the community is so much smaller, and to an extent, the administration is, they cater more to the parents because at the end of the day, they sort of are the customer. That I feel like maybe that type of behavior gets highlighted a little more. That said, my child does go to a private school in DC. I mean, talk about
Wait,
irony of
what?
irony. Yes. I mean, that's part of the reason why I used a pseudonym, is because I
Hmm.
didn't want anybody getting into my children's business. And I mean, I can say that there are no parents like the parents I write about at my child's school.
So I think one of the reasons people maybe assumed everyone was real is that, you go really out of your way for other forms of verisimilitude. Like you name check the
Hmm.
Cactus Cantina and the
Hmm.
Starbucks.
Hmm.
Geographically, I can picture where everything
Hmm.
is taking place. How important to you was it to get all of those things, with such a degree of specificity?
I did that on purpose to make the reader feel like it was real,
Hmm.
basically. When I think about that reader, I want them to feel like they're in Washington. And so that's why I put in the Cactus Cantina. That's why I put in, the Tate. That's why I put in the descriptions about like Aki lives in Adams Morgan, right?
Hmm.
Now, people want to make the jump and say, because all those details are true, the entire story must be true. It's a little one dimensional, I feel like, in terms of
Right.
understanding, how things are written. But if they want to, they should.
The irony here is a lot of the sort of comedy of the book takes place in as the sort of school's bureaucracy tries to like put in place new like new protocols so
Yeah.
people won't be racist. And so when I ask you this question, I'm not actually looking for new protocols, but the big takeaway for you, like, what do you think has to change about this world? And I don't mean schools and their administrations. I mean more like the sort of socioeconomic geographic class that you are satirizing.
Well, so I think it is different depending on what generation you're in. When I was at Sidwell, the tuition was still affordable for most people. My parents were not millionaires and they could afford to send me to Sidwell. But now the cost is so prohibitive for so many families that even with financial aid, you are going to get a significant portion of families who are very, very wealthy. And that does not mean that they are bad people or that they
Right.
do bad things. But I think there is, unfortunately, a subset of those parents who do have a sense of entitlement. And so when I write about these families with a sense of entitlement, it's not everybody, but those are sort of the people that I think are worth maybe not thinking about per se, but I think they're what make sort of the story fuller and more interesting. When I talk to my kids about how is race discussed in school and how do you ever feel singled out or do you ever feel bullied or any of this stuff, and they will say to me, things are different now, in a tone that only a obnoxious teenager can deliver, as if they have discovered Atlantis and a unicorn riding through it. I do feel like the tools that they have are different than the tools that we had. And so I am the first to admit that the lens through which I see race relations and how people react to racial incidents is older and benched or couched in my generation and how I understand things. And so, like, I think they should do XYZ is not necessarily how the younger generations think that things should be discussed. After George Floyd and after the pandemic, there was this sort of boom of DEI consultants and a boom of sort of creation of affinity groups. And I think that their good did come from that. But when I talk to my kids about it, they will tell you, we don't have the same issues as you do in terms of talking about these things. So maybe you should let us,
Mhm.
let us guide the discussion. And I thought that was interesting. I'm not even sure that my point of view is relevant to younger people. Not to get too political science on you, but Bob Putnam wrote this amazing book called Bowling Alone. And he said that essentially the demise of community is going to lead to the demise of democracy. And if I were to sort of rephrase that, I would say the demise of community and community-oriented groups and clubs like the Bridge Club or the Bowling League. I think those are the vehicles to make race relations better. And I know that that sounds very butterflies and rainbows, but I even see it, within our school community, which is very, very diverse. But when you bring people together just around a meal or around, we have these coffees, when you bring together these parents based on shared interests other than race, I almost think that that is a better way to ease into a discussion about race instead of setting it up so obviously.
But I got to say, of the injustices that you sort of write about that are plot drivers in your book, the racial incident, everyone in the story agrees this was an appalling thing. Maybe some because some were more concerned about the embarrassment than they should have been compared to the injustice. But there's another injustice that it seems not everyone agrees it's appalling, which is that like the, rich and influential and entitled kids and parents especially are able to kind of get what they want and go where they want and so on. And that is a thing where there doesn't seem to be agreement on like, this is a thing we must fix. And my takeaway as a Ward 3 DC resident was that this is the thing where we got some work to do.
Yes. And I think this problem is endemic across not just private schools, but everywhere, right? It's not a new story to say the wealthy get away with things that the poor don't. It just happens to be, again, I think because these communities are so insular and so small, you see them in front of your face when you're part of them.
Yes, and I think these communities are much more willing to acknowledge that they have some work to do on the legacy of racism piece. It's a lot tougher to be faced with like, oh, we also permit a system where like one group of people gets to pull strings.
It's interesting that you should bring that up because it reminds me of a conversation I had with a parent who is on financial aid, and she talks about, why don't we talk about this more? Why don't we talk about income disparity? And why don't we talk about, it's almost like we go to school and we have to pretend that everybody is the same somehow in terms of income. And it's not true. And they should know that it's, that we have less and it is harder for us. And I want my kids to know that it is not a bad thing. And so listening to her, it was interesting. I think that there is sort of a reflex to make sure that nobody in private schools, a lot of the schools will go out of the way to make sure the people who are not as wealthy don't feel that way, right? By not highlighting sort of an income gap. But in the meantime, you do see very wealthy kids and very wealthy parents acting in a different way, or, the perception is that they get different treatment. I think this is endemic of all private schools. This is nothing special to school A or school B in DC. I think it is true across all private schools. Because at the end of the day, private schools, they rely not just on tuition, but on donors. And so that is the reason I think that some of these parents do get special treatment. And so as a more common parent, I have a fair amount of self-loathing in terms of sending my child to a private school. There were a lot of sort of extenuating circumstances that led us to sending our child. And it's a great, great school for our child. But these are sort of discussions that I have inside my head, which is, am I creating a fake world for my child? Am I sort of deflecting hard issues? Like, would she have been better off in a public school? But I'm not sure that's the case either. If you look at the disparity across public schools, there is no economic diversity in our public schools at all in Montgomery County. So it's a really hard question. It is not the school's responsibility to teach necessarily, I would say, like about income inequity amongst their own school population. I think there's a very good way to teach it within the curriculum. But in terms of like rich people getting away with stuff, that is just the story of the world. And so I don't think it should surprise anybody that it happens in any sort of private school setting. It's just true across all schools, I think.
Emma, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not post about it on your own Caddy Parents listserv? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.